again. There was still no answer. The Lancelot dragged her attention back to the fight as its large laser slashed away armor from her left arm. The endosteel bone creaked dangerously as the laser bit deeply into its metallic structure. Lowry fired back, her Gauss rifle blowing away all but a fragment of the armor protecting the LNC-2505's right arm. Darts of verdant energy from her pulse lasers also chewed at the enemy mech. One stuttering blast spent itself ripping into the ground behind the Lancelot. The other burst melted away more than a third of a ton of armor from the rebel machine's right breast. Gamely, the Lancelot stayed in the fight, striking at Lowry's mech with a 1-2 punch from its lasers. She could only imagine the fiery heat the rebel pilot must be experiencing, despite the high-efficiency heat sinks in his mech. One azure beam flickered past the victor's head, but the other left a deep, carbon-edged score in its right shoulder. The Dying Time, page 228, by Thomas S. Gressman. I love covering battlemechs that were a bold gamble for a company seeking to break into the mech business. When the 60-ton LNC-2501 Lancelot marched into its first trials on Sol, a planet on the outer edge of the Draconis Combine in 2581, a lot was on the line. Krupp Interstellar Technologies had a lot riding on this venture as they had poured a significant amount of time and money into developing a machine they hoped the Star League Quartermaster Command couldn't pass up. The Lancelot would end up being only the first of 2 battlemechs that Krupp Stellar Technologies would produce on their lines in the Terran system due to their affiliation with a certain treasonous fellow named Amaris, but that's down the road a bit and putting a large laser before the horse. Before the Lancelot, the company was better known for their weapons and electronics packages which were sold for use in battlemechs of other manufacturers. For now, the SLDF were pleased with the battlemech's performance in the trials. Sure enough, a contract for production was offered and Krupp began to produce what they hoped would be a premier battlemech. The design criteria demanded a battlemech that could operate with limited dependency upon ammunition and could also move quickly and keep up with shifting battlefield and campaign conditions. Krupp's design team pulled out all the stops with the Lancelot. The star of the technological show was the Hermes 360 extra light fusion engine that traded size in order to shave down on mass. At just 16.5 tons, the Hermes engine could push the Lancelot up to 97 kilometers per hour on flat, stable ground. That's a 690 movement profile for those playing at home. 9.5 tons of Panzer Slab Type 5 plate armor were added to the mech in a manner that created a sleek and angled profile. This wasn't done just to make the mech look cool, which it did, but to also encourage glancing shots from incoming fire hitting armor panels at extreme angles. 13 double heat sinks were added in order to make the energy weapon build more viable, even though it pushed up the cost of the mech considerably. Speaking of weapons, Krupp took advantage of their in-house production of lasers to kit out their Lancelot. 2 Krupp Model 32 large lasers were added to the mech, split between the arms, and for an all-ranges 1-2 punch. They were aided by the addition of a Kinslaughter particle projection cannon placed into the right torso. Finally, 1 Krupp Model 2 medium laser was added to the center torso. The all-energy build set the Lancelot apart from many of its other SLDF-era peers, which tended to have more blended loadouts. In this case, the beauty of the Lancelot was in its simple utility. Its Mechwarrior could fire the PPC in both large lasers while on the run and only end up at 2+ heat into the red. This means that 3 volleys could be fired before any negative heat effects would set in. Additionally, going from 9 movement down to 8 once that 5+ heat threshold was crossed wasn't the end of the world. The Lancelot was a machine that could be pushed hard with consistently high damage output. Metal clasps snapped around his heart and squeezed until he couldn't breathe. Snatching up his rangefinders again, he brought the battle into exquisitely painful focus. A large laser from the Nighthawk and a PPC from the Lancelot almost merged into a unified energy stream before slamming into the right leg armor of the Knight. A ton of armor sublimated instantaneously before clumping and hardening under the extreme temperatures into a rain of ill-shaped and misbegotten pellets, which peppered the snow, turning the idyllic white, disease-ridden. Visions of Rebirth, page 76, by Randall N. Bills. The first SLDF contract for the Lancelot was for 250 in its first production run. Ramping that up, production required the acquisition by Krupp of a smaller company named Sater Manufacturing. Very quickly, the Lancelot was identified as a supremely useful, if pricey, Battlemech. Designed in tandem, the Lancelot's electronics package was well integrated, everything was in its proper place, and the advanced systems allowed the Mechwarrior an unparalleled level of command and control over the mech. Things like armor status and temperature were far more accurate than in other designs. As the Lancelot filled the ranks of the SLDF, it was identified as a useful anti-air platform as well, a role not originally envisioned by the designers. In 2594, the first official refit for the Lancelot was designated the LNC 2505, which will be confusing later on, I promise. It maintained the original basic structure, armor, and speed, but dropped down to 11 double heatsinks. In an act of what could be described as divine inspiration, the medium laser was pulled from the mech in favor of 4 standard machine guns split between the arms, all fed by a single ton of ammunition in the center torso. The rationale for it was to lean into a scouting role and provide the Lancelot 05 with enhanced anti-infantry capability. I suspect the real reason was just wanting to see 4 big machine guns all being fired at the same time. After all, we wouldn't see a Piranha for another half a millennia. The next significant variant was actually an experimental design under testing by Krupp before things got weird. It took advantage of 8.5 tons of ferrofibrous armor, 13 double heatsinks, and an endosteel frame to maximize mass savings. This allowed for the installation of 4 jump jets, shifting the O1X's movement profile to 694. Additionally, the traditional large lasers were upgraded to brand new ER large laser tech, allowing the mech to act as a very mobile sniper. It was a very powerful, if expensive, upgrade to an already pricey Battlemech. Its only significant issue was heat generation if that right torso PPC was added to the fire of the 2 ER larges. Still, in a moment of heated interpersonal conflict, just let them all fly and enjoy the sauna. As previously mentioned, the plans for the O1X were scuttled as the company was wrapped up in larger scale nonsense. It is worth noting that the O1X did make a reappearance down the timeline in the hands of one Captain Edward N. Smith, who was employed by the Northwind Highlanders. Apparently, his family came into possession of one of the Krupp prototypes, and with the help of the NAIS, he was able to get it back into fighting shape. Smith went on to earn some fame in the mech when he carried out a death from above attack against a Draconis Combine Highlander. Not too shabby. Unfortunately for both Krupp and the Lancelot, the machinations of Stefan Amaris would end up dooming the Battlemech. When Amaris launched his coup, the Terran system-based company was suddenly in a situation where they were strongly motivated by their desire to continue breathing. Therefore, they made the choice, which really wasn't a choice, to produce not for the SLDF, but for Amaris's new empire. Ultimately, Krupp even went so far as to finish the design for a brand new flagship Battlemech for Amaris called the AEM-01 Dragoon. It weighed in at 70 tons and shared very little with the Lancelot besides the use of an XL engine and a PPC. The first Dragoons were distributed to Amaris' loyalists in 2771, and plans were quickly put into the works to open up additional production lines for the Battlemech. When Kerensky and the rest of the SLDF arrived in system, Krupp's production lines were devastated. What remained of the Dragoons' lines were forced to stop making it, as the mech, Krupp, and by connection the Lancelot had been smeared by their work for Amaris. When Kerensky packed up his toys and left the Inner Sphere with the Exodus fleet, there were quite a few Lancelots packed up in the holds of those dropships. This created a split development path for the noble Battlemech with very different outcomes. One would end up being an often overlooked battlefield menace, while the other struggled to justify its own existence. To not be under Nicky's thumb. Andary couldn't imagine it, and the idea spun him away for long minutes as his eyes unconsciously tracked the ebb and flow of the battle. Blank autocannons and missiles painting targets, powered-down energy weapons blazing the air. His attention coalesced from unconscious to conscious, though, as the Lancelot pilot used the speed of the heavy Battlemech to maneuver a much slower Crocket into a boulder-strewn region on the far right of the valley, which allowed the Lancelot to speed through and kick the Crocket as it struggled to find good footing. The Lancelot pilot was clearly superior, and it sent it crashing to the ground. The trial was over, and much to everyone's surprise, the Hell's Horses had carried the day. Land of Dreams, page 124, by Randall N. Bills. When Alexander Kerensky's attempt at restarting civilization out in the deep periphery turned to violence, the Lancelot played a role on both sides of the conflict between fledgling clans and the Pentagon worlds. When Diane Sennett led her Sea Foxes against the defenders on Babylon, she did so from the cockpit of her Lancelot. The plot for our noble Battlemech thickened in 2832 when the clan fire mandrill Kindra Smythe Jewel produced their first Lancelot C, the significantly upgraded version of the classic Battlemech. Though it retained the overall sleek look and speed of the original, the power of the Lancelot C was ramped up. Thanks to the shift to an endosteel frame, 3 additional double heat sinks were added to the mech, as well as 3 clan-grade large pulse lasers put between the arms and the right torso. When combined, all 3 lasers offered accurate fire that could devastate lighter mechs in a single volley. Thanks to the 16 double heat sinks, it could fire all 3 large pulse lasers while on the run and remain heat neutral. This offered opponents no quarter as the battle progressed, short of knocking the mech out completely. This was easier said than done, factoring in the mech's speed and clan-grade XL engine with only 2 criticals in each side torso. The bright side for the Lancelot's opponent, if there is a bright side, was that the engine criticals in the left torso were all by their lonesome, so if you do achieve a critical hit there, you're sure to hit the engine. The Lancelot C ended up playing a crucial role in the trial with Clan Coyote to obtain Omnimech technology for the fire mandrills. Placed into swift-moving stars of lighter mechs as a hunter and scout, the Lancelots added unexpected power which caught the Coyotes off guard. Picking their targets carefully, including one of the coital Omnimechs, the Lancelots enjoyed the limitations on concentrated fire thanks to the rules of Zellbriggen. Once they tagged a lighter mech, the other Coyote mech warriors held their fire lest they trigger a melee response that they would surely lose. As with so many other clan refits at the dawn of the Omnimech era, the Lancelot C's days as a premier battlemech were numbered. The Lancelot C production line ended up in the hands of Clan Burrock, which continued to make the battlemech until it was deemed obsolete thanks to fast, heavy battlemechs like the Timberwolf and Summoner, which proved deadlier and more popular with clan warriors. The production line was eventually retooled to produce a different machine, and the remaining Lancelot Cs were relegated to second line and garrison units across the clans that still had them. On our way back to the Inner Sphere, we're going to stop and pay a visit to the Comstar operatives who dug into the Combine investigation of strange attacks being carried out on the edge of the periphery by what was described as the Minnesota Tribe starting in 2825. In a report generated by ROM Precentor Emilio Travis, he states that in one of the raids on Richmond, one of the mysterious mechs was identified as, quote, a Lancelot battlemech of exceptionally high quality. That mech was brought down in the fighting, and the Mechwarrior's personal gear proved to be gravely concerning as its advanced technology was far beyond anything the Inner Sphere could produce at the time. The uniform patch showing the former U.S. state Minnesota and the numbers 331 stitched into it suggested additional possible connections to Kerensky's Exodus fleet. That combined with a second patch depicting a Wolverine led Travis to conclude that this mysterious raiding unit was a surviving portion of Kerensky's followers. While not directly a Lancelot tale, I still think that's a neat bit of fluff. I know there are quite a few fans of the Minnesota Tribe content out there, so enjoy. I powered up my Lancelot and shot a salvo from my PPC. By the will of Blake, my shot hit true, square on the cockpit canopy of a Blackhawk. The warrior inside stood no chance of surviving. The Blackhawk slowly turned, then crumpled. The rest of my company did the same, firing everything it had into the raging fire and smoke. Our sudden attack seemed to shock the Ghost Bears. They had fled across 20 kilometers of raging fire just to be trapped between the flames and our firepower. Post-combat interview, Adept Shintaro Datsun, 12th Division, Comstar Sourcebook, page 71. As is so often the case in our universe, good things can come to an end. It's unfortunately the same for the Lancelots left behind in the Inner Sphere. With the widespread destruction and spiteful acts of the Succession Wars, technologies that the Lancelot relied upon to be an efficient hunter began to erode. The double heat sinks, the XL engine, and advanced electronics of the LCN 2501 were lost to the ravages of seemingly unending conflict. The bright side for this story is that the Lancelot would not go completely extinct. Though the original Lancelots would gradually end up as battlefield scrap or break down, all hope was not lost. Following the Second Succession War, the fine people at Luthien Armor Works managed to get their hands on the blueprints for a Lancelot. Though unable to recreate every element of the original, they were able to cobble together a Succession Wars-era approximation. Some might call it a pale imitation, but let's try to stay positive. The LCN 2502 Lancelot produced on Luthien was hobbled by the shift to a standard Pitband 240 Fusion engine, which dropped the mech's top speed to just 64 km per hour. Unfortunately, losing this greatest asset wasn't the last of the O2's issues. The machine's 9.5 tons of armor remained untouched, thankfully, but the need to use single heatsinks pushed the Luthien team to cram 19 of them onto the mech. This still wouldn't be enough, as we'll see. The weapons loadout was the same, though the manufacturers of each weapon were different. The Lord's Light PPC and two Sunglow large lasers provided the same possible damage in single shots, but the overall DPS was limited by the mech's inability to wick off the heat generated. Firing just the two large lasers while on the run was fine, but adding in the PPC at any point was a recipe for significant movement and accuracy penalties. For a mech that was already now moving at a 4.6 movement profile instead of 6.9, this was a problem. Still, with that all well understood, production began on Luthien and the Lancelot was saved from becoming yet another Star League design that went the way of the dodo. Most of these O2 Lancelots could be found among DCMS units, which isn't a surprise considering where they were being manufactured. It was stated that they tended to serve in a fire support role in the same way that Davion units used their Jaegermechs. Now, before we leap too far forward on the timeline, we do need to talk about an odd duck Lancelot designated the LNC 2503. In an act of what could only be described as mechanical terrorism, the two large lasers were removed from the mech and replaced by a pair of AC-5 autocannons. The fluff says it was done out of necessity, so I suppose we should forgive them. At some point in the future. Not now, though. The autocannons were fed by just a single ton of ammunition, which left the mech with only a PPC and a medium laser after 10 paired shots. The one bright spot for the O3 Lancelot was the boost to 13 tons of standard armor. That should help it live a little bit longer as it's retreating from the battlefield. Tara sprinted in pursuit of her fellow Highlanders as a PPC burst narrowly missed her, its azure flash passing far too close to her cockpit. Colonel Osborne in a Demolisher tank tore into Captain Boyd's Osprey, blasting the right leg into melted and torn bits in a barrage of autocannon and laser fire. Darcy nearly toppled as a Lancelot piloted by Sergeant Major McLean melted glowing hot scars on the Griffin 2C's shoulder. Osborne spun around fast as he realized they were targeting him specifically. Duties and Obligations, page 137, Legends 1, by Blaine Lee Pardoe. Though the Lancelot would not see a Helm Memory Core upgrade, the LNC 2501 and 05 would make a triumphant return on Tukiad. What's really fascinating is that the mech not only shows up in Comguard units, but the O1s were also spotted among the second-line clan forces along with the Black Knight and Flashman. Apparently there were still enough of them around after all of this time. After the trial, Precentor Marshal Vogt ordered the old Krupp Stellar production line on Mars refurbished in order to produce the LNC 2501s. Finally, after all this time, new Lancelots would march into battle. As the 3050s became the 3060s, the Lancelot served in the ranks of both Comstar and the Word of Blake. Frequently, they were employed to keep aerospace assets in check. This would prompt further modifications and official variants as we move further down the timeline. In 3060, the first of those new modifications was codified in an official variant designated the LNC 2504, which is not at all confusing. Its designers utilized Endosteel, the XL engine, and shifted over to 10 tons of ferrofibrous armor, which provided 179 points of protection. 14 double heat sinks promised to keep the mech mostly cool in spite of its energy weapon loadout. The traditional set of weapons is honored with an extended range upgraded version of the large lasers and a particle projection cannon. All of them were aided by the installation of an improved C3 computer set into the center torso. It's a very clear-cut, simple upgrade, and it made sense at the time when designers were slapping a C3 computer onto everything they could. The 04 Lancelot is a solid build, and even though it does run hot if bringing that ERPPC into play, it could be worth it in the right moment. At least there's no ammunition that can explode. In 3071, the LNC 2506 leans even harder into that sniper role with a significantly improved accuracy in its loadout. The mech is basically the same as the LNC 2504, though the gyro was swapped out for an extra light version which brought an additional 2 tons of mass, which was spent on a targeting computer installed into the left torso. So at the cost of a slightly more vulnerable design, those ER large lasers and ER PPC could hit more accurately when the moment was right. The LNC 2506 will absolutely ruin someone's day, and then laugh about it. It is a monster. One writes urbanized to express the distinctive gentleness of the period. It was quite peculiar to the crowded townsmen of the time, and different altogether from the normal experience of any preceding age, that they never saw anything killed, never encountered, save through the mitigating media of book or picture, the fact of lethal violence that underlies all life. The War in the Air, 1907, page 173, by H.G. Wells. Also in 3071, an alternative variant designated the LNC 2508 was similar to the previous 2 Lancelots. It also took advantage of the XL gyro, carried just 10 double heatsinks, and was protected by 9 tons of light ferrofibrous armor, which offered 152 points of protection. It leaned into the anti-air role with 2 LB-5X autocannons that were split between the arms and each fed by their own 1 ton of ammunition. They were backed up by the traditional right torso PPC, and all were aided by an improved C3 computer. The 08 is one of those niche variants that makes a lot of sense in universe and not so much in the tabletop. Unless you're bold and playing against aerospace fighters, you might want to give this one a pass. It's an interesting build, but I'm just not a big fan of putting ballistics weapons on a Lancelot. The first indication that he had a pair of Lancelots on his right were when they cut into his left arm. Multiple beams of emerald fire sliced into the limb. Then the Comstar machine's PPCs sliced away his arm at the elbow. It fell with a massive crash. Half his remaining firepower had been cut away. Ian staggered sideways, fighting to regain his balance. A storm of lasers sliced past him, just to the left. The Lancelots must have been holding off on their PPCs to manage their heat. Ian backstepped, firing his lasers again and again and again. No sense worrying about heat now. He hit the closer Lancelot, but it was just a holding action, and all 3 pilots knew it. Always Moving, The Battle of Tukiad, page 129, by Stephen Mohan, Jr. And now finally, the most recent official variant of the Lancelot arrived on the scene in 3147 thanks to Luthien Armorworks. This latest and greatest design reflected the advantages that the Combine had with access to so much clan technology by the midpoint of the 32nd century. Constructed from Inner Sphere endosteel and XL engine, 15 double heatsinks, and 10.5 tons of Inner Sphere grade heavy ferrofibrous armor, much of the machine remains true to its foundations as an Inner Sphere Battlemech. Where things went off into clan world was with the weapons loadout. Both of the ER large lasers split between the arms were clan grade, able to reach out to 25 hexes for their 10 damage. The medium pulse laser set into the center torso was also clan spec. That's pretty much it for the Lancelot 09, except for, oh yes, the plasma rifle in the right torso. Fed by 2 tons of ammunition stored next to the weapon, the plasma rifle offered its 10 damage plus 1d6 heat to heat-synced targets, and even more for infantry and anyone else who gets in your way. The 15 double heatsinks do a good job of keeping the mech cool, firing both ER large lasers while on the run. Even adding the medium pulse laser doesn't send the mech into the red. However, if the plasma rifle comes into play, choices have to be made lest those heat effect modifiers come into play. Overall, I like this Ilclan era variant for the Lancelot, and I don't get to say that often. It maximizes its use of critical slots, filling every single one in order to cram in its 4 weapons and heatsinks. I can't think of any obvious way to make a change to this design short of replacing the ER large lasers with large pulse lasers, making it into a quasi-Lancelot C. Let me ponder that. If you have notes on this, I'd love to hear them. Meka, deal with the Hermes. Aft Star Captain. Meka flatly responded. Thomas knew her well. She would be displeased with how the trial had moved away from her honorable dueling, but she always knew that the Kindra came first. Her Lancelot twisted away from the horse hoplite, barreling toward her, and her 3 pulse lasers spat out rapid bolts of energy into the sprinting Hermes' legs. The light mech slammed into the ground as the lasers neatly amputated its left leg from its body. The impact sent the Hermes tumbling over itself, and Tomas spared a moment of pity for the Mechwarrior being tossed around inside their cockpit. Desgra, Shrapnel No. 9, page 104, by Etienne Charon Willard. While we're on the topic of creating a murder machine, let's go ahead and dive into the totally unofficial and non-canon MF variant. As tempting as it was to just push back from the table and declare the Lancelot 09 a perfect machine, my hubris and ego wouldn't let it go that easily. It's quite similar to the 09 in structure, with the XL engine and 10.5 tons of heavy ferrofibrous armor. However, I did swap over to clan-grade endosteel to buy a few critical locations that will come in handy later on. 16 double heat sinks were also added to help keep the mech relatively cool. For weaponry, I built it around twin clan-spec large pulse lasers, which carry most of the water for the design. Starting in mid-range and adding to the light show were a pair of clan ER medium lasers in the right torso. Finally, for close-range conflict resolution, 3 clan small pulse lasers offered their accurate if short-ranged fire. While heat could be an issue close-up with the small pulse lasers in play, in general the LNC-25MF is otherwise heat-neutral, firing the 4 primary weapons in the mid-range. The original purpose of the Lancelot was to eat up lighter battlemechs and be a swift scouting heavy, and I think the MF fits the bill. Of course, as always, if you think otherwise, please let me know. If you want to give the Lancelot MF a try, I've included a PDF record sheet for it in the video notes below. Aim small, miss small, Mechwarrior. Nicole fought to keep her mech upright during her headlong rush down the hill. She circled a large tree and swung Wicked Wind sharply to the left. A barrage of lasers flew through the air she'd occupied seconds earlier, and she imagined the cursing from the clansmen behind her. She rotated one of the Lancelot's limbs to the rear and snapped off a shot. Not a chance in hell of hitting him, but it might slow him down. A series of near misses shattered the trees nearby, and she redoubled her efforts to reach the deep forest ahead. No Rest for the Wicked, BattleTech, Slacktide, page 208, by Richard C. White. So why do we love the Lancelot? Well, if you even remembered the Lancelot existed, kudos to you. When I put out the call in the Discord server for painted up mechs, quite a few channel members recalled owning it from the Comstar Level 2 box, but fewer had had it painted up. There's also a dearth of official FASA or CGL art for the classic design. I couldn't find a single piece of art outside of the technical readouts, even as a background participant. The best we could do was the art from the old classic card game. I've been a fan of the Lancelot as an underrated member of that 2750 technical readout crew for a long time. The 01 original variant is a solid build that shines in a very tough-to-please 60-ton bracket. Most of the limited number of variants makes sense, and the mech's unique role in the Amaris Civil War and its resulting bad reputation stand as a good cautionary tale. I'm curious what you think about this noble battlemech. Has it seen frequent use on your table, or did you forget it existed until you saw the thumbnail for this video? Is there a variant you swear by? Let me know in the comments and we'll keep the discussion going. To everyone on the Discord who shared their awesome painted up Lancelots this week, thank you for digging them out for the photoshoot. If you felt the video was worthy, please don't forget to click on the like and subscribe buttons so that YouTube knows that it's worth showing to others who might not yet know the nonsense that goes on here. It's mostly painless. Mostly. If you want to go one step further and directly support the channel by throwing a few bucks my way each month, that helps me make the argument with the folks in the MechFrog compound that this venture is worth the effort for a little bit longer. I really appreciate it. Please take care of yourself and your loved ones and hold the line. Now go and make sure the world is a slightly better place today and tomorrow.